qualifying is over for the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, and it is Lando Norris in the McLaren on pole position as he just manages to hold off Charles Leclerc and Kimi Antonelli. But what did we learn? Well, in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at the data and doing a data analysis from qualifying. If you enjoyed the video, then please hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. But now, let's get into the video. As usual, I'll be talking about the top teams later on, so please do stick around for that. Yep, qualifying is over at Interlagos, and it was one of the most shocking sessions of the season, as we saw some major shocks during qualifying. In Q1 alone, Max Verstappen in the Red Bull went out, as Verstappen was really struggling with the balance of the car, as Red Bull made some changes after the sprint race, and it seemed to make things worse instead of better. But Max Verstappen going out in Q1 was not the only shock during qualifying. In Q2, Lewis Hamilton in the Ferrari also went out after struggling to get the lap time together. Teammate Charles Leclerc was struggling for balance as well, but he was able to hook up the lap time and get himself through to Q3, even if the car looked like it wanted to kill him. But a lot of drivers seem to be struggling to get the balance and get the lap time out of the car, so you could say that struggling for balance summed up qualifying. A lot of drivers were finding it very difficult, and we saw a lot of mistakes. Even pole sitter Lando Norris made a big mistake during his first qualifying lap in Q3, but he did eventually take pole position. But how did it compare to his sprint pole lap? Well, let's take a look at the two laps. And when you take a look at the two laps, there's some pretty big differences compared to normal. In the sprint pole lap, you can see that Lando Norris is quite a bit slower in a straight line compared to the Grand Prix pole lap. That tells me that Lando Norris was running with a lot more downforce during sprint qualifying, which could be because they were expecting rain for the sprint race, which never actually materialized. You can see that with the higher levels of downforce, Norris can brake later and also carry more minimum apex speed at the corners, meaning that actually over the lap, Lando Norris was faster in his sprint pole lap than his Grand Prix pole lap. Lando Norris' sprint pole was almost 3/10 faster than the Grand Prix pole lap. As mentioned, one thing that I did notice also is that the sprint pole lap was faster than Grand Prix pole lap once again. Now, why do I say once again? Well, that's because also at Texas and Spa, we saw the sprint pole lap be faster than the Grand Prix pole lap. And I do wonder if some teams are starting to also realise that they can run the car more, well, let's say, illegally in sprint races than they can in the Grand Prix. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that F1 cars have a limit on the amount of plank wear that they can get on their cars to be safely passable or legal. The sprint race is a lot shorter than the Grand Prix, which means that in theory they could run the cars lower to the ground to get more downforce from the floor. However, that would damage the floor a lot quicker. But with the sprint race being a lot shorter than the Grand Prix, well, they might just be able to get away with it and still be legal. It's an interesting theory, but I do wonder if some teams are starting to maximise that just a little bit more. So we've seen how the lap times compared, but now let's take a look at the top speeds that the teams are able to reach in qualifying. And what can we see here? Well, what we can see is that compared to Mexico, there's actually a very large variance in top speeds from the fastest car in a straight line to the slowest car in a straight line. There is clearly a couple of teams who have opted for higher downforce and probably are hoping for a bit of a wet race, and there is some teams who are very much expecting a dry race. The slowest car in a straight line is Sauber, who only reached 331 km per hour, whereas the fastest car in a straight line was Ferrari, who hit 340 km per hour. This straight line speed for Ferrari and also Red Bull might explain why they were looking a little bit sketchy at times. They could be running with pretty low downforce compared to the competition, and if it does rain, we could see them struggle quite a lot. Haas also have a pretty low top speed and are looking very strong in the dry. it will be interesting to see if they can race as well as they qualified with Oliver Bearman. And of course the same goes for the Racing Bulls cars. I just want to say if you are enjoying the video so far, then I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. But now, let's get back to the video and let's talk about Red Bull. For Red Bull then, it was a disaster qualifying session, and without a miracle and plenty of rain, it feels like this is the end of the World Championship hopes for Max Verstappen, as Verstappen goes out in Q1 on pure pace in a shock result, and teammate Yuki Tsunoda was only ahead of Bortoletto, who couldn't even get out on track after his crash in the sprint race. But for Verstappen, this was not good enough, and it looks like the car balance has fallen away with the new floor update. Let's compare the Q1 lap of Verstappen to the Q1 lap of Lando Norris, so we can see where the differences were. And when you take a look at these two laps, you can see some pretty big differences, and it's not looking good for Verstappen and Red Bull. At turn 1, for example, Verstappen brakes quite a bit earlier than Norris, which makes sense if he has less downforce on the car. Not only that, but look at turn 4, 8 and 12. These are some of the heavier braking zones on the track, and you can see that Verstappen cannot carry the same minimum apex speed as Lando Norris, which tells me that Verstappen is clearly struggling with getting the car turned. Not only that, but Lando is getting better exits from these corners as well. All of this shows that Verstappen and Red Bull have a lot of work to do, and they might need to take a pit lane start with a new setup and a new power unit to attack the Brazilian Grand Prix if they want to score any points. For Ferrari then, qualifying looked fast but very sketchy. The car for both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton looked pretty quick. However, it also looked like it wanted to kill them and spit them off the track at any given moment, and we almost saw a big shunt for Charles Leclerc at turn 4-5, but he just managed to catch the slide and ended up putting the car in P3 on the grid. But teammate Lewis Hamilton ended up going out in Q2, as it looked like he couldn't handle the poor balance as well as his teammates. But how did that happen? Well, let's compare the Q2 lap of Charles Leclerc to the Q2 lap of Lewis Hamilton. And when you take a look at these two laps, there is some pretty big differences, which I think shows how Leclerc was able to keep the car going forward despite the lack of balance that the Ferrari has. At turn 4, where we saw the Ferrari almost spit Leclerc into the wall, Leclerc later on was able to corner quite a bit faster than his teammates and get a better exit as well. But then look at turn 8 and 9 as well. Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari was significantly faster than his teammates on the throttle and also getting out of the corner. This is showing that Charles Leclerc is able to handle the difficult car slightly better than his teammates, and he was rewarded with a spot in Q3, which he also made the most of to start P3 in the Grand Prix. But in the Grand Prix, if I'm completely honest, I see Charles Leclerc and Ferrari going backwards. I just don't think it will be a very strong race car, given the race car looked very loose and very tricky to drive. For Mercedes then, it was a pretty good day, and they retook second place in the Constructors' Championship in the sprint race. But after qualifying, it was a bit of a surprise. George Russell looked to really struggle with the soft tyres and ended up doing his final run on the medium tyres instead. But Kimi Antonelli once again had a great session and lines up on the front row alongside Lando Norris. But how did he just miss out on pole position? Well, let's compare their two lap times. And when you take a look at these two laps, it looks like Antonelli lost a lot of time by braking very early for turn 1. But Kimi does use that to his advantage to get a better exit from the corner, and he starts to close back the time that he lost on entry. And by the time they reach turn 4, it's very, very close between them. But when it comes to the tight and difficult corners of turn 8 and turn 9, you can see how Lando Norris and the McLaren gets the car turned in the slower speed. This has just been a very strong point for Lando Norris all weekend long. And once again, the McLaren just gets great traction out of these slower corners. He also carries more minimum apex speed. Altogether, there is almost 0.2 of a second between Antonelli and Lando Norris. for Kimi Antonelli, he has a great chance of scoring a podium result, especially if Leclerc and Ferrari do struggle in the Grand Prix. And finally for McLaren then, it was pole position once again for Lando Norris, and Oscar Piastri was not that far off, but it was not good enough for Oscar Piastri, and he is starting from 4th place on the grid. Honestly, for Oscar, this is a good recovery after dropping the car and crashing out of the sprint race. But how did the times compare between the two drivers? Well, let's compare the lap time of Oscar and Lando. And when you compare these two laps, you can see what we've seen quite a lot recently, and that is Lando Norris has a clear advantage in the slower speed corners. We saw it at Mexico, and we can see it here at the tight infield section. Norris just carries more speed and brakes later than Oscar. Not really sure where the confidence has gone for Oscar Piastri, but there are plenty of areas now where Lando Norris has the advantage over his teammates. In the Grand Prix, I can see Lando Norris winning pretty easily. As for Piastri, I can see him getting a P3 result, but the championship is now starting to slip away just a little bit from Oscar Piastri, and he really needs to do something to get back onto terms with his teammate. So, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, as always, please remember to comment, leave a like and subscribe for more F1 content, and also don't forget to check out Crash Happy, which you can find out in the description below. As for now, I just want to say thank you all so much for watching.